Hello everybody. In this video we'll start with a series where we'll take a look at every single extension in the latest version of Inkscape. Extensions are scripts that anyone can code and extend the core functionality of the program. Inkscape comes with about 70 or so built-in extensions, and some of them are really useful and would make a great asset for anyone interested in being more efficient, so I think they are certainly worth a look. I will go one by one and explaining what each of them does and how to use them, but I will not gonna go over every single button and option, mainly for the sake of brevity, but also because it's not necessary to be able to use them. Also, I will not gonna go over how to make your own extensions. Let me know in the comments if that's something that you would be interested on. In this part, I'll go over all the extensions in the Arrange, Color, Document, and Export menus. And one final thing, I would like to remind you that I make tutorials on Inkscape every week, so if that's something you're interested in, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, and also a like would help me a lot. That's all, let's begin. But before starting with the actual extensions, there are a couple of things I would like to address. First, in the Extensions menu, there is an item called Manage Extensions, which will open up a menu where you can see and install even more extensions. These are community-made, meaning they are not made by the Inkscape team, and could potentially have malicious code, so be warned. All you have to do to install any of them is to select them and click on Install Package, and that's it. One thing to keep in mind is that here you can only see a few, but if you go to the Inkscape download section in the Inkscape site, you'll see the full list. Right now there are close to 250. It would have been really nice if all published extensions show here, but sadly if you want some of them, you'll have to install them manually. I will not go over how to install manually downloaded extensions in this video. There are already tons of tutorials on how to do that, and that's not what this video is about. But let me know in the comments if that's something you will be interested I go over. And second, this can be really important for usability, as we'll see in a minute. Inkscape lets you set up a custom shortcut for each extension. Just go to Preferences, Interface, Keyboard, and here you go to Extensions, and you should see all extensions there ready to be assigned a shortcut. This will make more sense with a particular type of extension. I'll let you know about it when we get to those. Okay, now let's start with the Arrange menu. These two extensions deal with groups and see order. Deep Ungroup will allow you to ungroup deep nested groups. If you have groups within groups within groups, this menu will allow you to ungroup everything automatically without having to go in manually. You can use the menu to specify some options, such as what groups to keep in from the top and bottom, though most of the time you'll want to leave everything as it is. This extension can be useful, but it's nothing that you cannot do better by just selecting the group and hitting Ctrl-Shift-G multiple times until everything is ungrouped. Restack will change the stack order based on the position of the selected objects. This is the first time that we see a menu with a live preview option. Enabling this option will make it so any change that you do on the menu will be shown on the objects in the document. Otherwise, you will have to wait to see what happens when you apply it. So I recommend you to always enable this option when you see it. Anyway, you have two important tabs. Based on position, we'll restack the objects based on the position. Here on Restack Direction, you have a drop-down where you can set the direction, left to right, right to left, bottom to top, and so on. You have other options, but I don't think they are as useful. The other tab, based on See Order, has a single drop-down where you can reverse the order or make it random. If it helps, you can open the Layers and Object dialog and take a look how the order changes with the options set with this extension. This is one of the extensions I find quite useful. It's always a pain to go in and change the C order manually when you have a ton of objects, so keep it in mind for those designs that have a ton of objects overlapping. Let's continue with the Color menu. As you may have realized, these extensions deal with color, and there are a ton of them, so instead of doing what I usually do and go one by one from top to bottom, this time I will break the order a bit and group them together according to their functions so they are easier to understand. First, I would like to go over the extensions that have dialogues. These are the ones that have 3 dots. The other ones do not have a dialogue and are executed immediately, and are heavily related to each other, so I want to leave them for later. Black and white will not do what you think. Funny enough, we'll set the selected shapes to be either full 100% black or full 100% white, depending on the value of the color. You have a threshold input, and depending on the number set and the color of the object, it will set both the fill and stroke color to full black or white. Like with many of these color extensions, it's not that useful for a single object, but if you have hundreds of objects and you need them to be either black or white, depending on the value of their color, it can be exactly what you need. Custom will let you change the color by using some mathematical functions, including variables, multiplications, divisions, sums, and rests. It is used to set colors relative to an already set color, for example to halve the amount of red of an object or to duplicate the quantity of green. You have three built-in variables, R, G, and B for red, green, and blue, and you can use mathematical symbols to do some basic operations on them, which will set a new color. You may be thinking that setting colors mathematically is pretty useless, but again, you have to think in terms of setting some general color changes to a ton of objects at once who all may have different base colors. HSL Adjust will adjust the color of the object by changing its hue, saturation, and lightness. The changes are done relative to the already selected object. At 0, 0, 0, there is no change, and from there you shift the values. Being able to shift the colors of an object in real time is super useful. The problem is that this isn't really real time. It always takes a second to make the change, even with the preview button enabled. The interface is also really difficult to use. I wish there was a color wheel or something better to make the changes. Randomize will set a random color value for the hue, saturation, lightness, and opacity. You can set the range with these sliders, set them to 0 to avoid any random change on the value. This extension will also give it a separate colors to the fill and stroke. Replace color will take a color and replace it with another one. With the first tab, you can set the color you want to replace. You should use the dropper here to sample from the color you want to pick. With the second tab, you set the new color. It will not work with gradients unless you pick the exact same color from one of the swatches. In that case, the swatch will be swapped with a new color. One thing I don't think I mentioned is that the UI in the extensions is a bit clunky. If you have the preview button enabled, you will not be able to interact with the document, so you will not be able to sample. Just disable the preview button temporarily, and after sampling you can go back to enable it. At first glance, these extensions may not seem to be that useful, but it is quite interesting when you have a ton of duplicated objects and you would like all of them to change to a new color. And those were all the extensions with dialogues. Let's move on to the other ones. These extensions do not have dialog options and do one quick thing, a quick change in color in this case. And because the change in color will usually be subtle and you may want to repeat them multiple times, they can be a good candidate to use with shortcuts, so keep that in mind when we see the next extensions. This I will group together. Brighter and darker will set the selected object to be brighter or darker. If you look at the HSL color mode, you will notice that the extension will raise or lower both the hue and saturation slider a bit, so it changes more than just the lightness. How much it changes those sliders depends on the color set, but it's always very subtle. A couple of very important things to know. First, any change you do will also affect the stroke. And second, both also works with the gradients, which is awesome. Desaturate and Greyscale will set the object to black and white in different ways. Desaturate will just set the saturation to 0, just like going to the S slider and setting it to 0 there. But worse because the extension also affects the stroke. Greyscale will also remove all saturation, but it will also adjust to maintain the same lightness than before, so it's more useful than Desaturate overall, though it also affects the stroke. Both of them works with gradients. Less hue, less light, less saturation, and the opposite ones, more hue, more light, and more saturation, will add or remove just a bit of hue, light, or saturation to the color. You can see it more clearly in the HSL mode, where the hue slider changes in a value of about 20 and about 5 for the saturation and lightness. List all will output a list with the hexadecimal color value of the fill and stroke of all the selected objects. The hexadecimal value can be set into the RGBA box as a way to copy the exact color. If no object is selected, then the list will show all objects present in the document. This extension is useful to get a list of all the colors present in a large pool of objects, but since you don't get the object name, it's a bit less useful in my opinion. Negative will set the object to its negative colors, really useful, and it keeps the fill and stroke separated. RGB Barrel will shift the colors around, red, green, and blue, so basically it will add full red, then green and blue. A bit of a bizarre extension in my opinion, or perhaps I'm not understanding exactly what it does. Finally, remove green, blue and red will do just that. Take all the green, blue or red from the color of the selected objects. The document menu has extensions related to handle some documents and canvas options. DocInfo will show some information related to the document in a text box. Nothing you can't see in the document properties, but still nice to have. DPI 90 to 96 and DPI 96 to 90 will change the page size to fit with the DPI standards. More important for printing than anything, this is yet another extension with no options. I recommend you do not touch this unless you know what it means. Guides Creator is a really cool extension that will create guides automatically for you. These are normal guides like the ones you pull from the rulers, only that this will follow and divide the page and adjust to its proportions. You have 3 tabs. The first tab lets you create rectangular guides that will divide the page in rectangles. If you have the guides dropdown set to custom, you can set the columns and rows here with these input boxes. But you also have the option to set a preset based on the golden ratio and the rule of thirds. On the next tab, you can set the diagonal guides that will bisect the angles of the page. You can enable and disable guides from each angle. The Margin tab has a lot of interesting presets with different margins. You can also use this dropdown to change the proportions of the margins in the different places. And of course, you can change the amount of columns and rows. All in all, this is a really nice extension with a lot of built-in guides. If you're interested in graphic design for printing, definitely check it out. The Layout submenu has 3 interesting extensions that are well worth to check out. An App Layout will create a table of square guides to print multiple illustrations in a page, like stickers. The Page Dimensions tab handles the size and margins of the page. With the size X and size Y, you can change the size of the page itself, and the guides that comes by default will adjust. You can also change the top, bottom, left and right margins from where the guides will start. The layout dimensions will change the dimensions of the guide. Rows and columns will change the amount of rows and columns. Size X and size Y will change the size of each square. The Marks tab will have some options on what's displayed on each guide, such as if you want a placeholder or if you want some cutting marks or padding guides. This is yet another really useful extension if you want to work doing this kind of printing. Perfect Bound Cover template will create guides for a perfect bound book. I am not familiar with anything related to the printing process, but for what I can gather, perfect bound is a bookbinding technique, and I'm assuming that this is a guide for making the cover, which requires a thick side, which depends on the amount of pages. This extension lets you input information about the physical dimensions of the book, like the size of the book, the amount of pages and cover thickness, and it sets up the Inkscape page and guides for you. Again, important extension to know. Printing marks will create standard printing marks like page information, color bars, and bleed and crop marks, all fitting with the dimensions of the page. In the Marks tab, you have a lot of checkboxes that lets you enable and disable all the different types of marks. In the Positioning tab, you have the options to set the offset and margins of the marks. Because this extension generates shapes, it does not have the option to preview it. In order to see the changes, you have to apply it. The final extension in the document menu is Process Illustrator SVG, which is used to correctly open any SVG file exported from Adobe Illustrator. If you open the extension, you should see very clear guides on how to use it. Just click on Apply right after opening it, and it should make everything work out. The Export menu contains extensions related to exporting. Export layer slices will export all rectangles in a layer as its own separate files. Just put whatever you want to export inside a rectangle of any dimensions. Make sure the layer name matches the name set in Layer with Slices, and set the exporting directory and the DPI. You can also enable icon mode so that you get different versions with different dimensions specified in the size input. Guillotine will let you use guides, the ones that you drag from the rulers, to divide the page area and export the resulting rectangles as different PNG files. Plot has always been disabled for me. I'm assuming it has something to do with the GcodeTools extensions that we haven't seen yet, but I still haven't found a way to make it work. Maybe it's something that only works on Linux. Anyway, we are skipping it. Win32 Vector Print is an alternative method for exporting PDF files that may work better with certain type of printers like laser cutters and engravers. If something you exported is not reading correctly as a vector shape, try exporting using this extension. Hello there, this is part 2 of a series where we learn every single extension present in the latest Inkscape release. If you haven't already checked out part 1, link to the full playlist in the description. This time we'll take a look at the menus GcodeTools, Generate from Path, Images, JessyInk, and Modify Path. Also don't forget to like and subscribe. I make Inkscape and illustration videos every week, and every like, subscription, and comment really helps out a lot and keeps the channel afloat. Okay, let's continue with the extensions. The GcodeTools menu has extensions related to using G-code in Inkscape. G-code is a standard language used for printing with a plotter or cutter. Inkscape is not made to be used with that type of printers, so you need extensions to add that extra information so your designs can be properly read. I've never used one of these printers for anything. I got no idea how to use G-code or how these extensions relate to G-code. I don't think I'm qualified to talk about these extensions at all, even if I'd learned how to use them. So I won't. These extensions are pretty niche anyway, so I guess it's fine if we skip the entire menu. I prefer to leave you a link to a video I checked out on G-code and Inkscape that look pretty good. The link will be in the description. Generate from Path has extensions that will generate new paths from existing ones, similar to the Generate and Experimental Path Effects categories, but not in real time, of course. Construct from Triangle will take the first 3 nodes of a path and generate different geometrical shapes based on their position. In the Common Objects tab, you have a ton of possible shapes to build. You can even select more than one option and generate more than one type of shape. Make sure to check them all. Then you have the Custom Points and Options tab. This will allow you to build a shape using math. I wasn't able to make it work, plus math is scary, so I'll just skip over it. Distribute along path is similar to the path effect pattern along path, but interestingly enough, it is a bit better if you don't count the fact that it's not real time, since you can actually use groups. Both objects have to be selected, and the one that will distribute the objects should be below. Follow the path orientation will make it so the object will rotate to follow the orientation of the line. Space between copies will adjust the separation. Normal offset will offset the path. Use negative numbers to offset it in the opposite direction. Rotate pattern 90° clockwise will do that. Rotate the object. The drop-down original pattern will be handles what will happen when you apply the extension. Move will move the original path from its position, basically deleting the original. Duplicate will leave it where it is and create duplicates. And clones will create clones, meaning that if you modify the original, it will pass all of its changes to the copies on the path. Very interesting option. Finally, if you enable the option If Pattern is a Group, you can spread multiple different objects along the path. With the drop-down Pick Group Members, you can select how they are going to be selected, randomly or sequentially. All in all, a great extension to keep in mind. Extrude between 2 paths is like a combination between the path effect Extrude and Fill Between Many. This extension will generate a path that joins together 2 different paths. It uses the nodes to define where they will join, so it's best to use paths with equal amounts of nodes. In the Mode dropdown, you have three options that control how the path will be generated. The Line mode will just generate lines connecting each node. By default, the extension will group all the different paths, but if you enable the option Combine Lines to Single Path, will instead make a single path with no group. This option only works with the Line mode. The Polygon mode will create polygons based on the lines made by the nodes. And Follow Curves will do the same, but they will follow the curvature of the paths. This is most likely the option you want. Another useful and interesting extension to keep in mind. Frame will generate a rectangle or ellipse to match the bounding box of the selected objects, thus framing them. The most important options here are the Frame dropdown, where you can choose between using a rectangle or ellipse. Then there is the Treat Selection as Group checkbox to treat the different selected objects as a single object, creating a single frame. The Stacking Order dropdown will change the C order of the frame. Another useful options could be the Clip Selected Objects to Frame, which will do that. Use a clip to hide every section of the object that sticks outside of the generated frame, which can happen when you select the ellipse frame type. And of course you have the Style options, which are the exact same they show on the Fill and Stroke dialog. Inset Offset Halo will generate other paths that will follow the contour of the selected path. The generated path will merge and join together and have a lower opacity, making this halo effect that looks great. Width will handle how far away the offset will be. The maximum is 50. And number of steps will handle how many paths will be generated. I don't know if this is a bug or a feature of the extension, but when using the preview, every time you change some value, it will not delete the old generated paths, so watch out for that. Interpolate between paths will take two different paths and generate shapes that are the in-between, similar to the interpolate subpath effect, only that this extension uses two different paths. The most important option here is the interpolation step, which controls how many paths will be generated. Exponent will change the location of the generated path, so they'll be more to one side or the other. Interesting extension, but since you cannot use groups, interpolate subpath may be a better option. Check my path effect playlist to see how to use it. Link in the description. Long Shadow will generate a path simulating being a cast shadow. This generated shape will be most likely not a path, but a group of multiple paths. It works similarly to the extrusion extension we just saw. With the length option, you set the length. With the angle option, you set the angle in degrees. You can also enable Fill Shadow with the stroke color, which will do just that. Pattern Along Path is basically the extension version of the path effect of the same name, though this extension has a couple of extra options. It has very similar options to the path effect version. Copies of pattern will change the way the pattern is spread through the path. Most likely you'll want the option repeated. Deformation type will change the way the object deforms through the other paths. This is something new to this extension. Snake will rotate the object to match the rotation of the path, and Ribbon will always place the object upright no matter the direction. Space between copies will change the spacing, and normal offset and tangential offset will change the offset. Don't forget you can use negative numbers. You can also hit pattern is vertical to flip the object. This extension does have those deformation options that are not present in the path effect, but they are not worth the sacrifice of the real-time controls in my opinion. Borono diagram will generate a Borono diagram, which is this, I think. In the type of diagram, you can switch between Borono diagram, which will create these cells around the object, and Delunate triangulation, which will make these points, and a combination of both. You can also show a bounding box of where the diagram is active. The Images extension menu has extensions that control how images are handled in the SVG document. Many options in these extensions are repeated in the preferences for the images. I remind you that to access the image options, you can go to Edit, Preferences, Imported Images. For the most part, you'll want to leave everything here as it is by default. Embed Images will embed the selected image into the SVG document. By default, any imported image will be embedded into the SVG document, meaning that the image will be stored inside of the SVG file. This is usually what you'll want.
But you can disable that in the imported image preferences by changing bitmap import mode to link. Link has its benefits. The SVG file will be much smaller since it no longer stores the image. But the drawback is that if you lose the image, you mess up the document. Anyway, this extension will force all of the images in the document, or in case you enable this checkbox, only the selected images, to be embedded, even if you have the bitmap import mode set to link. It's a bit of a useless extension in my opinion, because going to the options and changing the mode, it takes like 5 seconds. Extract images is a bit more useful, because it allows you to save to your hard drive the images present in the document, whether they are embedded or not. Once again, you have the option to affect only the selected images, or all the images in the document with this checkbox. You have to set a directory. One option that can be useful is link extracted images, which will set every extracted image to be linked. That is, it will remove the embed mode from that image, which is something that you may want to do after getting the images, maybe to make the document of a smaller size. Set image attributes will change some options regarding the way the images are displayed. Many of these options seem to be legacy because they are not present in the imported images preferences. Plus, every option I choose here will result in the image getting this placeholder item. That's why I wouldn't recommend you to touch anything here. The default options and the ones you can change in the imported images preferences seem to do just fine, and nothing of what is shown here looks super important. The JessyInk menu has extensions that allows you to use JessyInk. JessyInk is a group of extensions that embed JavaScript inside the Inkscape SVG files in order to add some presentation software functionality, basically letting you make slides with animations, transitions, keyboard and mouse navigation, and all of that. Sadly, however, you can only see the animations and interaction when you open the SVG file in a web browser. Remember that the SVG format is designed for web. All Inkscape documents open in web browsers. Since there is not an interactive interface, there is no effective way to pre-visualize what you're doing until you export and open the document in the browser, making everything really slow and awkward to work. As it is right now, I wouldn't recommend you to use it for serious work, even if you feel more comfortable with Inkscape. Any dedicated presentation software has the same functionality and more. I think JessyInk is certainly worth a look, but maybe more as its own thing and in its own video, but not along with other extensions. In any case, let me know in the comments if that's something you will be interested on. For now, we'll skip this menu as well. I promise you this will be the last menu we'll skip. The Modify Path menu has extensions that change the geometry of a path. Add nodes will add nodes based on a specified set of segments or in a particular length. You change the mode based on division method. The first mode, by max segment length, will take the value set in the maximum segment length and will add nodes to divide the path into the number set here. It is a bit difficult to calculate how the path will be split if you don't have an accurate measure, so I find this mode a bit difficult to use, especially because you don't have a preview. The other mode, by number of segments, will use the number of segments input and will add nodes so you get that amount of segments. Much more easy to use in my opinion, but still not as easy as adding nodes manually with the Add Nodes button in the tool controls of the node tool. Approximate curves by straight lines is an interesting one. It will take a path with curves and it will transform those curves into a series of straight lines. With the flatness input, you can control how close the straight lines will follow the curves. Convert dashes to paths will convert a stroke with dashes applied to a series of strokes. This extension exists because when you transform a stroke with dashes to a path using path stroke to path, it will transform each individual dash into a closed path. This extension, on the other hand, will transform each dash into its own stroke, something that you cannot do in any other way in Inkscape. Envelope deformation will do the same thing than the envelope option in the perspective envelope path effect. You need two paths. One will be the envelope and the other one will be the one to be distorted. That one needs to be on top and cannot be a built-in object. If you use one, you'll need to transform it to a path by going to Path Object to Path. Also, you can use it with groups, which is nice. I wouldn't recommend you to use this extension. It does the same thing than Perspective Envelope, but with much less options and not in real time. Fractalize will roughen up the shape, creating multiple planes. Subdivisions handle how many planes will be created. and smoothness, how smooth is going to be the change in planes. Inset Shadow is a bizarre extension that does something similar to what a filter would do. It creates a light and shadow area inside of the shape, making it look like a relief or a button. Internally, this extension uses a black shape and a white shape that follows the contour of the selected shape and that have a blur applied and are inside a clip. You can even break it apart after it's been applied. Illumination angle will change the angle of the light. Shades, how many sections of light and shadow there will be. To me, it starts to look bad after going past 3. You can also control the blur in other options, but that's best left to handle once it's been applied. This extension can save you some work if you want some quick and dirty light, but to me it looks horrible. I'd skip it and do it manually. Jitter nodes will do just that. Slightly move the position of other nodes up and down to make the shape more wonky. This extension works best with a shape that has a ton of nodes. Don't forget that you can add nodes by using this button in the tool controls of the node tool. The only truly important option here are these two inputs, where you set the amount of displacement in the X and Y direction. You can also shift the handles for extra wonkiness. Perspective does the same thing than the perspective option in the perspective envelope path effect. Just like the envelope deformation extension, you will need two paths, and the one that will be distorted needs to be on top. And just like with the envelope deformation extension, I see no reason to use this extension when you could use the perspective envelope path effect. So skip it. Pixel Snap will snap your objects to the pixel grid. In Inkscape, like in most vector software, you don't usually work with the pixel grid like in a Raster software. That's why Inkscape won't show it and you can't interact with it. But if for some reason you need an object to snap into what it will be the pixel grid, maybe for when you're exporting a small object, then you can use this extension to do that. Rubber Stretch is a really cool extension. It will stretch any object vertically as if it were made of rubber. You'll need a lot of nodes on the path for this extension to work nicely, so don't forget to add them with the Add Nodes button in the tool controls of the node tool. Strength will handle how much it will be pulled, and Curve, how much it will bend inwards. A really fun and interesting extension. Straighten segments will straighten any segment between two nodes. Percent will control the strength. At 0% it is untouched, and at 100% it will be fully straight. Behavior changes the way the curves are straightened. You only have two options and they don't make much of a difference. I got no idea what do absolute does. I've searched online and the only thing I could find is that apparently Inkscape stores the position of the objects as either absolute or relative, and I think this has something to do with that. Maybe useful at the moment of opening an SVG file in a browser. In any case, I couldn't find what it does. Sometimes it moves the position of an object in a group far away, and sometimes it doesn't. Maybe someone can illuminate us in the comments. Twirl will twirl the selected objects. Like with many of these distortion extensions, you'll want the object to have a ton of nodes to look the best possible way. Amount of twirl will control the strength. The bigger the number, the more turns it will make. And if rotation is clockwise is checked, the twirl will be done clockwise. Otherwise it will be counterclockwise. Hello there! In this video we'll continue learning all the extensions in Inkscape. This is part 3, where we'll take a look at all the extensions in the raster and render menu. This time we are looking at only 2 menus, because they are quite big and have a ton of extensions we have to go through. But before starting, I make tutorials on Inkscape every week, so if you're interested, make sure to subscribe for more. Also, every like and comment are highly appreciated and helps the channel a lot. Okay, let's continue with the extensions. The raster menu has some of the most useful and interesting extensions in my opinion. Everything here deals exclusively with bitmap images that you import. They will not work with paths. It tries to add some degree of image processing functionality to the program. Obviously, it will never be at the level of an actual raster software like Photoshop or GIMP, but if you need to do some quick adjustment to an image, this menu has you covered. Adaptive Threshold performs a special type of threshold. In image processing, thresholds are a way to get a black and white only image out of a picture. Very important, This does not mean grayscale. The resulting image will be made of only two colors, black and white. Anyway, adaptive threshold is a technique to achieve that. It is made particularly for this type of images where you have this unequal lighting, like badly scanned books where traditional thresholds may not work as well. The only controls are the width, height, and offset. I'm not a graphics programmer. I got no idea what each input does. I just mess around with the values until I get what I want, and I recommend you to do the same. Add noise will add different types of noise. In the option there is only a drop-down and no intensity controller. You should go one by one and try the different algorithms and see if one of them works for you. It's such a shame the lack of an intensity controller. To me that makes the extension almost useless. Blur adds a simple blur. Many of these raster extensions seem to have two generic controllers, radius and sigma, and usually they tend to do almost the same thing. In this case, they control the intensity of the blur. Channel displays only the selected channel of an image. A channel is a black and white representation of one of the colors present in the image. With this extension you can see most channels, though the cyan, magenta, yellow and black do not seem to work for me. Also, the opacity channel will display the opacity of images that can display opacity, like PNGs. Charcoal creates this relief look that to me it doesn't look at all like charcoal made, but that can be useful to get a nice effect in your work. Once again, you have this generic radius and sigma input. Radius will control the intensity of the effect, and sigma how dark or light it is. Use sigma between 0 and 1. Colorize will let you add a color tint. You can select the colors with any of these selection modes. This extension seems to work better with black and white images where the local hue is less of an influence. Contrast enhances the contrast. There is a single input that lets you control the intensity of the change in contrast. Crop will let you crop the image based on 4 inputs. It is fairly simple to use but really awkward because you don't have a visual or interactive way to see the cropping. It is a bit of trial and error. Cycle color maps changes the color map, whatever that is. I tried experimenting with the extension and searching online for the definition, and I'm still not sure what it is or what it does exactly. The extension does swap the colors of the image, so I'm guessing it has something to do with that. The amount input goes from 0 to 360, but I can't identify exactly what it is doing other than swapping some colors. I don't see a specific use I could give to this extension, but again, I'm not a graphics programmer. This speckle will remove the speckles and grain out of the images without destroying too much the edges. It has no options and it works great. Dither adds dither to the image, which is a type of noise apparently used to avoid other visual artifacts, like color banding, though because there is no way to apply any of these effects to a particular area of an image, it can damage areas where you don't want it. The only option is amount, which controls the strength of the effect. Edge will try to detect the edges and make this black and white result. You control the intensity with radius. Depending on the image, different radius numbers will work better, though usually you'll want to keep it to the lowest possible. Emboss adds this border at the edges to simulate an image being embossed in a surface. You have the two generic options, radius and sigma, though only sigma seems to do anything. I've had the best results, keeping it between 0.1 and 2, though like with most of these effects, you should try it for yourself and see what works best for your particular image. Enhance seems to only minimize noise a bit, like the speckle but weaker. Equalize will equalize the color frequencies. I'm not entirely sure how it works internally, but you can use it to get this really nice Instagram filter look for your images. It has no options. Gaussian blur will add Gaussian blur, which is a different type of blur than the previous one we saw. It has those generic options, factor and sigma, and you control its intensity with both of them. HSL Adjust lets you replace the colors of the image with new ones. It works similarly to the Colorize extension we already saw, only that sadly you don't have access to the color selection widgets, which is extra frustrating because replacing colors is much more useful than what Colorize does. This extension is also really useful to set an image to grayscale, since you don't have a Raster grayscale extension for some reason. Just set the saturation input to 0. Implode will distort the image to make this effect like it's imploding towards the center. You cannot control the location, but you can control the intensity with the factor input. Level and level with channel both do the same, letting you change the color levels. The difference is that with level, you change all the channels at once, and with levels with channel, only the specific selected channels. This is one of those extensions that's really difficult to understand without a real-time visual widget like in a proper raster image processing software. Basically, black point and white point controls how light the lights are and how dark the darks are, depending on the input. And gamma correction adjusts the overall lightness. If you choose level with channel, then all of this is applied only to the selected channel in the dropdown. Why couldn't both extensions be a single one, where you could select between one of the channels or all of them at once? I don't know. Either way, it is really awkward to use this extension. If you need to adjust the levels, I would recommend you to go to a proper image processing software. Median sets a median filter, which is a nice looking kinda blurry style of filter that has a bit of a hand-painted look, especially at high radius. Negate will set the image to its negative, no options. Normalize changes the range of the contrast to make it more equal. Sometimes you get a nicer looking image, no options. Oil paint is a really nice extension that will make your images look like an oil painting. The effect is really nice and convincing, and it's super easy to use. Just a single input to control the intensity. Opacity changes the opacity. It does the exact same thing than lowering the opacity in the fill and stroke dialog, but internally they are both separated. If you lower the opacity with this extension, the only way to raise it back again is by using this extension. The two opacities do not interact with each other. In any case, I would recommend you, if you want to lower the opacity of an image, use the option in the fill and stroke. It's much easier and faster and does the exact same thing. Also, this only works on images that support opacity, like PNGs. Raise will add planes to the corners of the image to create this raised or lowered look. With the width and height, you control the thickness of the border. Don't forget the border eats away the pixels from the image, so you may not want to go too thick. Raise will change the illumination of the planes to make it look like it's raised or lowered. Reduce noise is similar to despeckle or enhance. It is meant to reduce the noise of an image, but now you can control the intensity with the order input. Try to keep the intensity low, or the extension will start to damage the borders of your image. Resample will resize the image to the selected size without changing its proportions. It is used mostly to make an image of an unnecessarily big resolution to a smaller one, so it runs better and consumes less memory. With the width and height input, you set the new resolution of the image. This is not a percentage, this is the actual new resolution in pixels the image is gonna have. It is possible to give it non-uniform values, but the extension will automatically correct them to maintain the proportions of the image. Also, if you export it using the extract extension we already saw in the previous section, you will get the new image with the new resolution. Shade does something similar to emboss. It creates this type of curved surface effect. With azimuth you control the light direction, and elevation should control the elevation, but for me it only controls how light or dark it is. Colored shading will apply the color on top to make it really similar to the emboss extension. Sharpen will sharpen the image. You control the intensity with the radius and sigma again. Keep the values relatively low, otherwise the image will start looking bad. Solarize will create this bizarre effect, almost like a negative, but only on selected colors. You control the intensity with factor. At 100%, it looks normal, but going down from there, it starts applying the effect more and more. Swirl is similar to the implode extension we already saw in that it distorts the image. This time it swirls from the center. Like implode, you cannot control the location, but you can control the intensity with the degree input. Unsharp mask. I'm not entirely sure what it does. At first I thought it had something to do with unsharping, or maybe something to do with an Inkscape mask. But I tried everything and I just couldn't get it to work. Maybe somebody in the comments can tell us what it's supposed to do. Wave is one of those extensions that distort the image. This time it makes a wave pattern. With amplitude you control the strength of each wave, and with wavelength the space between each one. A smaller wavelength results in a bigger quantity of waves. One thing I found annoying is that you start to see a white background at the top and bottom borders, and there is no way to adjust that. The render menu has extensions that will build out some sort of path using algorithms. In my opinion, some of the coolest and most useful extensions are on this menu. 3D Polyhedron from the submenu 3D creates a 3D polygonal shape using normal everyday Inkscape paths. This is very important. While you can rotate it and scale it and change the illumination, it is not really a 3D shape at all. At no moment Inkscape is loading to memory or rendering a 3D object. What it's doing is using the data in this extension to generate a group of 2D paths that look like a correct 3D object. Once it's been created, you can go in and edit the path normally if you want. In the Model tab, you can select a built-in primitive from the Objects dropdown. You have a ton to choose from. Most of them have weird names and I don't even know what they are. You can even load your own custom .obj 3D file. OBJ is the standard 3D file format. Most 3D modeling applications can export OBJ files. You have to use the final item called load from file. In the file name input, you have to put the name of your OBJ file, which has to be placed in the poly3dobjects directory in the Inkscape install folder. It would have been more comfortable to have access to a load or import menu, but that's what we got. Right now they are being drawn straight from the front, which is not very descriptive. It is possible to rotate them in the View tab. The rotation input boxes set the rotation in degrees. You'll have to first select the axis for each rotation. Not the most intuitive way to control the rotation, but it works. The next tab is the style. Scaling factor will scale it uniformly. These options will control the fill color, opacity, stroke opacity, and width that will be used to generate the shapes. Again, a bit awkward having to input the numbers for everything. It would have been amazing to have access to a color selection mode. The shading checkbox enables and disables the illumination. Light X, Y, and Z control the location of the light source. It appears to be a directional light, by the way. The Show drop-down controls how it's gonna be rendered, only edges, points, or everything. All in all, this is a really cool way to get a 3D model into Inkscape and have it be editable. But the truth is that controlling everything with these inputs is a complete pain, to the point I would rather import an image of a 3D model and then trace it over manually, if it's not too complex. Still, one of the coolest extensions in the program in my opinion. Wireframe Sphere, also from the 3D submenu, will make a wireframe sphere. This extension works similarly to the previous one, in the sense that it will create an editable path with the options you set in here. Lines of latitude and lines of longitude sets how many lines the sphere is gonna have. Tilt and rotation controls the rotation in degrees. And radius will set the size. A very useful option is hide lines behind sphere, which will do that, making the sphere more readable. Great and easy to use extension if you need a globe or something like that. Classic is the first extension in the submenu Barcode QR Code, which contains barcode or QR code generators. This one will let you create classic barcodes, like the ones you see in different products. Barcode type sets the type of barcode. There are a lot of them, and I have no idea what they do, but if you want to use a barcode, you probably will. Barcode data sets the actual data the barcode will encode. The type of data changes depending on the type of barcode. If you put it wrong, Inkscape will tell you what you need in an error message. Bar height changes how tall the bar is gonna be. Data matrix will let you make a data matrix. which is this type of code that consists of black and white dots that can encode text. Text sets the text to be encoded. The size dropdown sets the size of the matrix, and the square size controls the size it's gonna have in pixels. QR code makes a QR code, in case you aren't familiar. It's basically another scannable code that uses a black and white matrix to store text. It's really popular to use with URLs, so people can scan them with their phones and lead them to a website. The text field sets the text. Invert QR code inverts it so it's surrounded by black instead of white. And square size to set the size. Then you have some options related to how it looks. The most important options are the smoothing of the dots. You set the value with the smooth square value. And you change the type of smoothing with the options in the Smooth tab. Then you can change the shape with the Shapes tab, making it so it's made out of circles instead of squares. Really useful extension, these three ones. Calendar will build an actual working calendar, and I find that surprisingly cool for some reason. With the Configuration tab, you set how it's gonna look. You can set the year, the amount of displayed months, whether to fill the days or not, show the week. You can even set the date the week will start, and what days are weekends. Really thorough options. With the Layout tab, you set the overall way it's gonna look. Automatically set the size and position will make the calendar fit in as best it can to the page size and dimensions, so you control how it's gonna look by adjusting the page. If this option is disabled, then you can adjust how many months per line there are with this option, and the size and margin with these two inputs. In the Colors tab, you set the colors for each of the elements. Just click on the buttons to open a color selection menu, though it's not hard to go in and change the colors manually after the calendar has been created, and it's probably more easy this way. Fonts changes the fonts. Just like with the colors, the user interface is a bit tricky to use. You have to actually write and know the name of the font you want. Just change the font with the text tool after the calendar has been created. It's way easier. And with the Localization tab, it's possible to set the day and month names, as well as the week names, and the character encoding in case you're not using standard text. Really cool and useful extension. Foldable box will create the guides that you use to build a box that can be folded with tabs, like wrapping boxes. The shapes are always generated in the page area. Width, height, and depth are used to set the size of the box, and tab proportion, how long the tabs are going to be. Function plotter will graph a mathematical function on a selected rectangle. The rectangle will be used to define the location and scale of the graph. Here's the thing, I tried playing around with it, and I found that I still hate math, and I have not the willpower to push myself through. I honestly don't get what anything is doing here. I can guess more or less, but I honestly don't feel like you or me are gonna enjoy going through this. So I'm gonna leave to you the exploring of this extension, and we'll move on to the next one. Have fun doing math. Gear from the Gear submenu will create a gear, in a similar way to the gear path effect, but making a single one instead of multiple ones. Number of teeth sets how many teeth the gear is gonna have. Circular pitch sets the diameter of the circle. Pressure angle controls the shape of the teeth. The higher the number, the sharper they'll be. Diameter of the center hole does that, sets the diameter of the center hole. 0 eliminates the hole altogether. Rack gear will create this saw teeth shape. Rack length controls the length. Because the shape's teeth are always the same relative size, tooth spacing controls the overall size of the shape. And contact angle is how sharp the teeth are gonna be. At 0 it looks like a square, and at 45 looks like an actual saw shape. Cartesian grids from the grid submenu will create a Cartesian grid. Inkscape is just a grid with the possibility of adding subdivisions. You have a lot of options here. Border thickness controls the thickness of the stroke around the border. Then you have two tabs, one for the x-axis and another identical for the y-axis. This controls some options regarding the sizes and subdivisions. Major divisions defines how many divisions are gonna be per axis. Measure spacing, how wide or tall are gonna be each cell. It is possible to subdivide each cell into smaller ones with a thinner stroke using subdivisions per major division. It is also possible to even subdivide that with subdivisions. With major, minor, and subminor thickness, you control the thickness of the stroke of each type of division. Grid just makes a simple grid, this time without the possibility of subdividing. It is also always created aligning with the page at the center. Line width controls the stroke size of the entire grid. Horizontal and vertical spacing is how wide or tall are the squares. And horizontal and vertical offset, the offset from the center of the page. Isometric grid creates an isometric grid. X and Y divisions control how many divisions the grid will have. Division spacing is how big it's going to be. Just like with the Cartesian grid, you have the option to add subdivisions and subdivisions. And just like there, you have thickness control for each of them. Polar grid will create a polar grid, which is a round grid made of two parts, an inner circle and an outer one. A bit less useful than the other grids in my opinion, but a nicer option to have. Inside the center there is a dot for some reason, and with center dot diameter, you can make it bigger or smaller. Then you have options for the two types of divisions, the circular and the other ones. In the circular division tab, measure circular divisions controls the amount of circular divisions, and measure circular spacing, how spaced apart they are. Just like with the previous grids, you can also add subdivisions and change the thickness of both. Angular divisions has pretty much the same options with a couple of variances. Angle division controls how many divisions there are going to be in the outer circle. Angle divisions at center controls how many divisions are going to be in the inner circle. You can even have subdivisions, but only on the outer one. And of course you can control the thickness of both. L system creates something mathy, I think. It makes this tree. According to the help, it uses the text in the input axiom and rules to generate the tree using these F's and pluses. Then there are these input boxes, which seem to control the overall shape of the tree, such as how many copies there are, and the angle it leans on. Like with many of these math extensions, I don't feel entirely comfortable talking about them, because I didn't expend enough time to learn the ins and outs, so excuse me if I skip this one too. It also looks really niche too. I got no idea who could use it. Nice charts will create a visual chart with the data you give it. It is meant for data visualization. The Data tab is where the data is handled. Here you got two subtabs, Data from File and Direct Input. With Data from File, you can open your own CSV file. Though I haven't been able to find out where you should place the file, so it's found. It is not in the same directory than the SVG file, that's for sure. Anyway, skip it to the right tab next to it. Direct Input allows you to input your own data. The sample text that comes by default shows you the format. It is one word followed by a colon and a number. You separate every item with a comma. With the input setup, you can go to the chart type dropdown to set the type of chart you want. You have four options: bar chart, pie chart percentage, which will assume the data was percentage based, and it will only show the field percentage, and a stacked bar. In the Labels tab, you can set up the font color and size. Just like with the calendar extensions, this uses a very weird and awkward interface to set these values. It's better to just wait until you apply it and go in and change those values manually, in my opinion. The charts label handles the way the charts look. Right away you can flip them with the Draw Horizontal checkbox. It is possible to control the length and width, radius and stroke width of each bar. You even have some color schemes you can pick from, though again, I would recommend you to do this manually after you apply the extension. Finally, the Values tab has a single option that allows you to show the number set. I find this to be one of the most interesting extensions, because just like with the calendar, it solves one problem you may have very well, plus it's really fun and easy to use. Parametric curves works very similarly to the function plotter extension we just saw. I'm not entirely sure what's the difference between this and the other extension. They both seem to do about the same thing, plotting a function inside of a rectangle using some kind of math input. In any case, just like with the function plotter, I will skip this one. Again, this is a very niche extension, most people won't use it or care about it, and I don't feel like spending any more time than the absolute necessary doing math. Random tree will create this tree-like shape using straight lines that is completely random. Initial size says how big and complex the tree is gonna be. Minimum size, how small the branches are gonna be. The smaller they are, the higher the quantity they'll be. I'm not entirely sure what omit redundant segments does, but it does seem to make the tree more balanced and symmetrical. Spirograph simulates the result of a spirograph, which is a device to make these weird curve-based shapes. After playing with it for a while, I still have no idea what each of these inputs do exactly. Some of them are fairly intuitive, like the rotation and radius, but others, like the ring and gear radius, I can't find out exactly what they do. I recommend you to just mess around with the values until you get something you like. Triangle will generate a triangle. The resulting triangle will be based upon the input's side length A, B, and C, which controls how long each side will be, and angle A, B, and C, which will be the angle of each corner. Very awkward to use because it's really difficult to visualize what is a correct triangle just by using text inputs, and very frequently you'll find yourself looking at this warning telling you that the specifications are invalid. Hey there! This video is the fourth and final video in a series of tutorials where we take a look at all 172 extensions present in the latest release of Inkscape. This time we'll be finishing by looking at all extensions in the last 5 menus: styles, text, typography, visualize path, and web. But before that, I would like to remind you that I make Inkscape tutorials like this every week, so if you're interested, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to enable the notifications. Also, a like and comment are highly appreciated and helps the channel grow. Okay, let's finish with the extensions. The Styles menu has extensions that deal with the style, that is, the type of properties that you can set in the fill and stroke dialog, plus some other stuff related to programming CSS. Color markers allows you to give your markers custom colors. In case you aren't familiar with markers, if you go to the Fill and Stroke Dialog's Stroke Style tab, you can use the Markers dropdown to give your nodes different icons. These are a special type of objects that are stuck to the stroke and cannot be edited on the canvas. And more importantly for this extension, they change color to match the stroke color, so it's impossible to give them their own color unless you redraw them, but that's a complicated subject for another video, maybe. But let me know in the comments if you would like a tutorial on markers. Anyway, continuing. This extension will let you change the colors of the markers. The From Object tab changes the color according to the color of the shape they are applied to. Marker type sets the type to solid or filled. Solid makes them a single color, and filled makes them have fill and stroke. The Custom tab gives you the same color selection mode from the Fill and Stroke dialog to change the fill and stroke of the marker. Overall, really useful extension if you work with markers. Interpolate attribute in a group is an interesting extension with a lot of potential. Basically lets you interpolate between a group of attributes, such as width, height, scale, and opacity. It works a lot like the Interpolate Shapes extension we already saw, but with custom attributes. The drop-down attribute to interpolate has all the attributes you can interpolate. I've had problems with some of them throwing an error for no reason, and I still have no idea how to use the other attributes correctly, but the common ones, width, scale, and opacity, work just fine. Anyway, you have to set the start value and the end value in these input boxes, and for every selected object, the extension will interpolate the selected attribute between those values. Like with most extensions we've seen, I feel it could have been so much more useful if it was more developed and with better UI, and maybe with at least a bit of documentation. As it is, I don't think it's that useful. Merge styles into CSS will create CSS code out of the style attributes of the selected object. In case you aren't aware, there is quite a lot of functionality inside of Inkscape for web development,
and the possibility to edit some CSS code is one of them. I don't want to go in depth into that because I know nothing of web development and I don't want to say something wrong. Plus, this extension does only that, creates a CSS class with the color and fill stroke properties of the selected object. Mesh gradient to path from the mesh gradient submenu creates paths that match the shape of the applied mesh gradient. In Inkscape, a mesh gradient works a bit like its own path that can or not match the shape of the path it's applied to, so this extension can be more useful than you'd think. The only option in the extension is the mode. Outline will create a path that only matches the outline of the gradient. Grid and patches add other paths on top to match the subdivisions of the mesh gradient. And faces make each subdivision its own shape, though sadly it often fails to close them properly. Path to mesh gradient, also from the mesh gradient submenu, is the companion to the previous extension. It will transform a 4-node path into a mesh gradient. This way allowing you to first draw the shape with the pen tool and then transform it into a mesh gradient. And that sounds awesome at first, because in Inkscape you cannot do that, like in Adobe Illustrator. But the problem is that it doesn't work like you think at all. The shape has to have 4 nodes, so there is that limitation. Plus, you cannot add other paths to control the subdivision, which will be the main reason to use this extension over just going to the Mesh Gradient tool and clicking on the object. Borono pattern fill will generate a Borono diagram, like the Borono extension we already saw, that will be applied and used like a normal everyday pattern fill, that you can see and edit, and even reuse with another object if you want. Average size of cell handles the size of each cell. Size of border defines where does it end. Leave it at 0. I really don't know why this needed its own extension. It would have been more or less the same to include a Borono pattern in the built-in patterns list. The text menu has extensions related to text. Some of them are well worth to learn for everyday work, especially if you work handling PDF files. Alphabet Soup will cut and displace the individual letters of a text to give it this glitchy look. The text is always generated at the center of the document. This extension cannot be applied to a text object. You'll need to use this text input to create a new one. Scale changes the size of the text, and Randomize will mess up the text even more to the point it becomes unrecognizable. The Change Case submenu contains 6 extensions which all do very similar things. They all change the case, so I'm gonna treat them as a single one. Sentence case will change the case so the uppercase letter will match a sentence, with the uppercase right after every dot. Title case will make it so the very first letter of every word is uppercase. Uppercase, it's all uppercase. Flip case will flip any uppercase letter with a lowercase one and the other way around. Lowercase, it's all lowercase. And random case, it's all random. Convert Braille will do that. Convert the selected text to Braille, which is a type of text that uses reliefs, so visually impaired people can read. Extract from selection will identify the text in your document and display it on a text prompt as text. This is more useful in cases where you have access to text, but it's not connected in a way easily readable, like it happens frequently when you import a PDF file into Inkscape. Formula, PDF LaTeX, does not open for me. Despite having the 3 dots, which means it will open up a menu, it just doesn't work. I tried searching for help online and opened it with older versions of Inkscape, but I had no luck making it work. So I guess we are skipping it. The one thing I should mention is that it appears to have something to do with writing or reading LaTeX in some way, which is a language for making mathematical signs. Hershey text will convert the text into a plotter-friendly font, so it's easier to print. I already mentioned it that I don't feel comfortable talking about this type of extensions that I cannot really test, but this one seems easy enough to understand. With the Render tab, you select the font, And with the Utilities tab, you can print an example of all the available fonts in the extension. Lorem ipsum will generate a lorem ipsum text, which is a very well-known type of placeholder text. Number of paragraphs will set the number of paragraphs. And sentences per paragraph sets the sentences per paragraph. In the Help tab, there is more explanation about how it works. If nothing is selected, the text will be created inside of the documents page. If a text object is selected, it will be appended. If an object is selected, the text will match the shape of the object. Merge will merge two or more different text objects into a single one. The spaces and separations will be respected. The extension will create a new text object inside the page. You have three dropdowns that control the text direction, the horizontal point, and vertical point. This is for when you are copying texts that are not aligned. Keep Style will keep any of the style in each text box after joining it. If this is not selected, the text will have the default font and properties, so most likely you'll want this checked. Replace Font will search and replace the fonts in all your text objects in the document. This is yet another extension that uses a simple text input to handle the fonts, so you better know the exact name of it. Luckily, the extensions has a tab that can help you with that. In the List All Fonts tab, you can make the extension show all the used fonts. You have a drop-down that will let you pick between showing the fonts of the entire document or only the selected fonts. Then you hit Apply, and that will open a text prompt with the proper name of the fonts. This can be useful if you have a ton of different objects that are difficult to select, or if you want the exact name of the font to not get it wrong. In the Find and Replace Font tab, you can replace a font of all instances of text. You have to specify the font you want to replace in the Find Font input, and the font you would like to replace it with in the Replace input box. The Replace Font tab allows you to straightaway replace every text in your document with a single font you specify in the Replace All Fonts input. Split Text will split a text box into multiple ones. With the Split dropdown, you get to pick lines, words, or letters. And Preserve Original lets you keep the original version. The Typography menu has extensions that are meant to help you to make your own fonts. You don't need these extensions at all to make fonts in Inkscape. In theory, these are meant to streamline the process of making them, but I found that, actually, for me at least, it makes it more confusing and complicated than if I were not to use them. But we'll go over them anyway, and I'll let you decide if they can help you or not. And just a quick warning, these extensions deal with font design, and some concepts may go unexplained, because this is not a tutorial on that, but let me know in the comments if you would like me to do a full tutorial on making your own fonts in Inkscape. That sounds a lot of fun. 1. Set up Typography Canvas. We'll give you a menu where you can set up guides, the same ones you pull out of the roller, to draw fonts more comfortably. I'm pretty sure the extension is numbered, because you're supposed to use it with the next two extensions that are also numbered. As far as I know, it does the exact same thing than hitting the Setup Canvas button in the SVG font editor dialog. It even has the exact same options. I guess the developers thought it was gonna be easier to access these options from here. These input boxes define the location and separation of each guide in pixels. I won't go over what each guide means, because they are related to font design, and like I said, this is not a tutorial on that. Just know that if you are into font design, then you will know what each of these inputs do just by reading the names. And that's all this extension does. To add glyph layer, will show a dialog where you can input the name of the letter, which will create a new layer with the name of that letter. It is possible to create multiple layers for different fonts at the same time by writing more than one character. To see any change, you should open the Layers and Objects dialog, and there you should see all the layers that were created. This is the moment where you will draw all the letters, one letter per layer, matching the name, and in the position set by the guides. 3. Convert glyph layers to SVG font. Will transform each layer into a glyph in the SVG font editor.
So to see any change, you should open it by going to Text, SVG Font Editor. What the extension did internally was pretty simple. Just created a new font in the Global Settings tab, and then created new glyphs for every single layer created by the previous extension. But here's what bothers me about this extension. In order for each letter to be assigned a path that will represent it, you need to select it and hit the Get Curves button. And you would think the extension does that automatically for you. But no, you still have to go one by one through each glyph, go into each layer and select the individual shapes, and click on this button to assign it. So the only thing this extension truly does is saving you from making 2 clicks to create a new glyph and write the character. It's ridiculous in my opinion, and that's exactly how I feel about these 3 extensions. Unless they do something I'm not realizing, I don't think they are that useful or that save that much time. Convert SVG font to glyph layer. I'm not entirely sure about what it's doing, but I think it just removes all the assigned glyphs, breaking up the setup SVG font. So the SVG file where you drew everything no longer can be used to generate a proper font. View next glyph and view previous glyph. It's just a quick way to enable and disable the visibility of the layers where the shapes are, so it looks like you're moving up and down the different glyphs. The Visualize Path menu has extensions that draw information about paths. Dimensions will draw an arrow on the top and left side of a path, like what you will need for a diagram that shows dimensions. The only important options are the X and Y offset, which controls how apart they are from the path. Draw handles will draw strokes on the places where the handles of the selected path should be. The handles are different objects and the extension groups them all together. It has no options. Measure path will draw the length, area, or center of mass of the selected path. Measurement type lets you select the type of measurement. Like I just said, you can pick between length, area, and center of mass, which will be displayed as a little cross in the location where the center of mass of the path is. You can set the location of the text with these tabs. You can set it to be either resting on the path or at a fixed location. With the first tab, Text Presets, you can select between different common presets, like the text starting on the first node or at the center of the bounding box. With the other 2 tabs, you can set the same options, but with more detail. Text on Path has an offset slider that controls the position of the text on the periphery of the path. Fixed Text lets you choose other placement with the position dropdown, such as the first node, the center of the bounding box, and the center of mass. You can even place it in an angle with the angle input. Then you have other general options down here. Font size sets the size of the text. Offset, how far away the text is from the path. Precision, how much numbers show after the dot. And scale factor scales the measurement according to the input here. Finally, you can set the unit you're working on with the length unit dropdown. Number nodes replaces the nodes on the path with numbered dots. Font size is the size of the number, and dot size is the size of the dot. Starting dot number changes the order of the numbering so the counting starts at a different node, and steps is how many numbers it skips in the counting. The web menu has extensions related to web programming and interactivity. Inkscape has quite a few tools related to web design, and these extensions work with some of these tools. I must warn you that I'm not a web designer or programmer, so I'm not familiar with any of these tools. I'll do the best I can to understand and relay the information to you, but a lot of the stuff here is going over my head. Interactive Mockup will add some very minor interactivity features to the SVG file when it's opened in a browser. It will just move the view to the location of an object. You need to have 2 selected objects. The first object you have to select is the one that will drive the action, and the second one will be the one that the view will follow after the action has been performed. From the action dropdown, you can select different types of interaction like clicking, hover with the mouse, or just gain focus. To be able to see this, you'll need to open the SVG file with a browser and then perform the action set. I'm not entirely sure what this extension is used for, but if you're a web developer, maybe you'll have an idea. Set attributes from the JavaScript submenu lets you set an SVG attribute, I assume using JavaScript, I'm gonna be honest, I'm not entirely sure how things work internally or why you will want to use this. Attribute to set has the name of the attribute you want to set. By default, it already comes with a list of example attributes like fill and stroke. With the dropdown when should the set be done, you set the action that will trigger the change. And with value to set, you set the value. Just testing the example, it all seems to work fine, and it seems pretty intuitive. But you do have to write the attribute names, and I'm not really sure about how that works, if it's something taken directly from Inkscape or XML or JavaScript or Python. Again, I think a web developer will probably understand this better than I do. Transmit attributes, also from the JavaScript submenu, does something similar to set attributes, but this time it will copy the attributes from one object to another. Once again, you'll need to select more than one object. The first object will be the one transmitting the attributes, and any other object after that will receive them. And again, you'll need to know the exact name of the attributes and write them in the input box, attribute to transmit. By default, there is already some example attribute written, fill. You need to set the action that will trigger the transmission with the dropdown when to transmit. And that's it. Now you open the SVG file in a browser and the attributes will be copied over. Create a slicer rectangle from the slicer submenu. Apparently will let you slice different parts of an image or something. This one, I have to be honest, I have absolutely no idea what is this extension used for or how to use it. There is no documentation anywhere. I did find an entry in a page that seems to be related to this extension that mentioned that this is some sort of slicer for web pages, but I don't understand what's the purpose of the raster image options. I'm guessing it is supposed to be used with web mockups, but yeah, I have absolutely no idea how to make this work. Hitting apply will create a red rectangle and a layer called web slicer, but without documentation anywhere and no help tab as a guide, I'm gonna have to skip this one. Export layout pieces and HTML plus CSS code is another extension from the slicer submenu, and this is yet another extension I have no idea what it does or how to use it. I think it has to be used in conjunction with the previous one, and obviously it has something to do with web development, so yeah, that's another skip for me. Set layout group is the final extension in the slicer submenu, and the final extension we are gonna cover. And yet again, like all extensions from the slicer submenu, we're gonna have to skip it because I couldn't make it work or have any idea what it is or what it's used for. I wish the final extension from this huge list would have been something more interesting to finish on, but once again, I'm not a web developer and without documentation, I couldn't figure this submenu. And that's it. We finally covered all 172 extensions in the latest release of Inkscape. Now we know a bit more of those obscure features Inkscape has. But maybe we can keep learning more about Inkscape. Let me know in the comments if you would like me to cover other obscure parts of the software. We did path effects, we did extensions. How about filters now? Or other features that I talked about in the extensions themselves, like JessyInk or the font editor. Inkscape is so much more powerful and deep than people give it credit, and I love to get deeper and deeper into it. One last thing before ending the video, I make Inkscape tutorials every week. If you get any use out of these or past videos, why not like and subscribe to the channel? It really helps other people to discover it and keep it alive. That was it for now. Have a great day. Bye.